Captain Cameron laughed in my face as the cockpit alarms screamed, telling me that female flight engineers don't make decisions. He fired me right then, at 35,000 feet, just before the left engine exploded. He thought he could bury my career under the wreckage of our highway landing, but he forgot one thing: I have the data he tried to burn. It was 06:15 a.m. when I stepped onto the tarmac of Newark Liberty International. The air was crisp, smelling of jet fuel and the early morning Atlantic breeze. I looked up at the Boeing 757, a massive bird of steel that I knew better than my own reflection. As a lead systems certified flight engineer, every bolt, every wire, and every hum of that aircraft lived in my bones. I'd spent 20 years earning my seat in that cockpit, and at 43 I was at the top of my game. I entered the cockpit to find Captain Cameron already in his seat. He was 60, silver-haired, and possessed an aura of entitlement that could fill a hangar. He didn't look up from his tablet. Beside him sat the first officer, who was busy trying to look busy. "Morning, Captain," I said, sliding into my station behind them. I started my pre-flight checks, my fingers dancing over the toggles and screens with practiced ease. My hands moved with a rhythm born of thousands of hours in the air, checking the hydraulic pressures, the electrical loads, and the oxygen systems. Everything had to be perfect. "Check the fuel levels, Scott," Cameron muttered, his voice dripping with a dismissive boredom. He didn't even use my title. "And make it quick. We have an on-time departure bonus on the line, and I'm not losing it because you wanted to double-check a gasket. Some of us actually have places to be." "Safety is the priority, Captain," I replied calmly, though my jaw tightened. I could feel the arrogance radiating off him like heat from a desert floor. He saw me as a checklist filler, a nuisance in a uniform. At 07:10 a.m., we were taxiing toward the runway. That's when I saw it, a tiny flicker on my monitor. A temperature spike in engine 2. It was subtle, hardly out of the green zone, but it was there. I felt a vibration through the floorboards, a rhythmic thrum that didn't match the usual symphony of the engines. It was like a heartbeat with a skipped beat, a subtle warning from the machine I loved. "Captain, I'm seeing a thermal variance in the starboard engine," I reported, my eyes fixed on the digital readout. "I'd like to hold at the threshold and run a diagnostic. The vibration signature is hitting a resonance frequency that isn't standard." Cameron didn't even turn his head. He adjusted his expensive sunglasses, the gold frames catching the morning light. "It's the morning sun hitting the sensor, Allison. Don't be hysterical. We're next for takeoff, and I'm not giving up our slot because you're seeing ghosts in the machinery." "It's not the sun," I insisted, my voice dropping an octave. "The vibration is mechanical. If there's a compressor blade issue or a fuel line leak, we shouldn't be rotating. We need 10 minutes. "I said we're taking off," he barked, finally looking at me with a sneer. "I've been flying longer than you've been wearing a uniform. I know my plane. Sit back, be quiet, and let the pilots do the real work." We roared down the runway at 07:18 a.m. As we rotated and the ground fell away, the vibration didn't vanish. It grew, a low-frequency growl that only I seemed to hear, a dark promise of the disaster to come. At 35,000 feet, the sky was a brilliant, deceptive blue. The cabin was quiet, filled with the soft clinking of coffee cups and the low murmur of passengers. We were leveling off over the rugged terrain of Pennsylvania when the yellow caution light on my panel finally flared to life. It was like a scream in a silent room. "Master caution," I announced, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Exhaust gas temperature on engine 2 is climbing rapidly. We're losing oil pressure at a rate of 3 psi per minute. We have a serious failure in progress." I reached for the emergency checklist, but Cameron's hand shot out, slamming onto my console. "I told you to leave it alone. It's a faulty sensor. I'm not diverting this flight to some regional strip and costing this company $500,000 because your nerves are frayed." "My nerves are fine, Captain. My sensors are not," I countered, staring him down. The first officer looked between us, his face pale, but he remained silent, a coward in a co-pilot's seat. "Listen to me, Scott," Cameron turned fully in his seat, his eyes cold and full of venom. "You are here to monitor, not to lead. You're a glorified technician. You women think you can come in here and make executive decisions based on feelings. Well, in my cockpit, I make the decisions. I am the authority here. This isn't a feeling, it's physics." I shouted as a violent shudder rocked the entire plane. The overhead panels rattled, and I could hear the engine outside beginning to surge. "The engine is going to fail. We need to shut it down and fire the extinguishers now before it breaches the cowling. If you touch that throttle, I'll have you in handcuffs the moment we land," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "In fact, consider your services no longer required. You're incompetent, insubordinate, and clearly unfit for this role. You're fired, Allison, effective immediately. Get out of that chair and go to the back of the plane." The clock on the dash read 07:42 a.m. At that exact moment, a thunderous boom shook the aircraft so hard the oxygen masks dropped in the cabin. The cockpit filled with the acrid metallic smell of burnt titanium and hydraulic fluid. The master warning alarm began its high-pitched, terrifying wail. Engine 2 wasn't just failing, it had disintegrated. The plane yawed violently to the right, the autopilot disconnecting with a mournful chirp. "Engine fire. Engine fire. We've lost all power on 2. The first officer screamed, his previous silence replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. Cameron was frozen. His hands were white-knuckled on the yoke, but he wasn't flying. He was staring at the wall of fire visible through the right-side window. The arrogance had vanished, replaced by the hollow, thousand-yard stare of a man who realized he'd just killed everyone on board. "I'm fired, remember. So I guess I'll just go sit and coach," I snapped, but I didn't move an inch. My hands were already a blur, flipping switches and cutting the fuel flow to the burning wreckage that used to be our engine. "Gabriella," I yelled into the intercom to the lead flight attendant. "Brace for impact. This is not a drill. Get everyone down." "We can't make an airport," the first officer whimpered. "We're losing altitude too fast. The hydraulics are leaking. The controls are becoming sluggish." I looked out the window, scanning the horizon. Below us, cutting through the dense, dark green forest of the Poconos, was a long, straight stretch of Interstate 80. It was our only hope. "There," I pointed, my voice cutting through the chaos. "The highway. It's our only chance. Line it up now." "You can't land a 757 on a highway. We'll hit a bridge. We'll explode." Cameron finally spoke, his voice trembling like a child's. "Watch me," I said, leaning forward and grabbing the controls. I wasn't just an engineer, I was systems certified and trained for every nightmare the simulator could throw at me. I felt the plane's heavy, sluggish resistance as the hydraulic pressure bled out. I had to time the glide perfectly, balancing the weight of the aircraft against the dwindling airspeed. We dropped through the gray clouds, the burning engine trailing a massive plume of black smoke. I saw the cars below scattering like frantic ants. I fought the yoke, every muscle in my arms screaming as I lined up the massive landing gear with the narrow strip of asphalt. 30 feet. 20. 10. I chanted, my eyes locked on the white lines of the road. The tires hit the pavement with a bone-jarring thud. We bounced once, twice, before the screaming of the brakes took over. We roared past a bewildered trucker, our wingtip clipping a highway signpost with a shower of sparks as we finally ground to a halt. The smell of burning rubber and smoke filled the cabin, but the silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. We were down, we were alive, and despite Cameron's attempt to fire me at 35,000 feet, I was the one who had saved his life. At 09:00 a.m. the following morning, the adrenaline had completely worn off, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion in my bones. I sat in Conference Room B at the airline's corporate headquarters. The air in the room was sterile and artificially chilled, smelling faintly of expensive floor wax and freshly brewed, untouched espresso. Across the heavy mahogany table sat Thomas Aris, the CEO of the airline, a man whose tailored Italian suit probably cost more than my first car. Beside him sat Captain Cameron, freshly showered, wearing a pristine uniform, and looking entirely too calm for a man who had nearly killed 200 people 24 hours earlier. Also present was Julian Bates, a senior FAA inspector whose reputation for being friendly with corporate executives was an open secret in the industry. Bates was nervously tapping a gold pen against a leather-bound notepad. "Allison," Eris began, folding his hands perfectly on the table. His voice was smooth, practiced, and entirely devoid of genuine emotion. "First, let me say that we are all incredibly relieved that there was no loss of life yesterday. However, the destruction of a $60 million aircraft and the resulting public relations nightmare is something this company cannot simply brush under the rug." I leaned forward, the leather of my chair creaking loudly in the quiet room. "The public relations nightmare. Mr. Eris, we had an uncontained engine failure. If I hadn't taken the yoke and put us down on Interstate 80, we would be a smoking crater in the Poconos. I warned Captain Cameron about the thermal variance before we even left the gate." Cameron let out a low, patronizing chuckle. He didn't even look at me, he looked at Eris. "As you can see, Tom, she is still hysterical, just as she was in the cockpit. Panic makes people see things that aren't there." "I am not hysterical, Captain," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "I am a lead systems certified flight engineer. I saw the data. The engine was failing." Bates stopped tapping his pen and cleared his throat. "Ms. Scott, my preliminary review of the surviving flight data recorders tells a different story. The black box was heavily damaged in the highway impact, but the fragmented data we recovered indicates a sudden, catastrophic disruption in the fuel mixture sequence. A manual disruption, from the engineer's console." The room spun for a fraction of a second. The air suddenly felt too thick to breathe. "That is a lie," I stated, staring directly into Bates's shifting eyes. "I cut the fuel flow only after the engine exploded to prevent the fire from spreading to the wing tanks. Are you telling me you're blaming me for the fire?" "We are saying," Eris interjected, sliding a thick manila envelope across the polished mahogany toward me, "that your unauthorized manipulation of the engine controls caused a compressor stall. You panicked, Allison. You overstepped your authority, ignored the captain's orders, and destroyed our aircraft." I stared at the envelope. It was a termination agreement, complete with a non-disclosure clause and a severance package that read like hush money. "The data on that black box was corrupted," Cameron said smoothly, finally looking me in the eye with a smug, victorious sneer. "It's a tragedy, really. But the FAA has all the evidence they need. Sign the paper, Allison. Take the money. If you try to speak to the press, our legal department will ensure you face criminal negligence charges. You'll never work in aviation again, and you'll likely spend the next decade in federal prison." I didn't touch the envelope. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling not from fear, but from a white-hot, consuming rage. I looked at the three of them, the arrogant pilot, the corrupt inspector, and the greedy CEO. They had it all figured out. They had successfully built a fortress of lies to protect their stock prices and their reputations. "Keep your money," I said quietly. I turned on my heel and walked out of the sterile room, leaving my 20-year career sitting on that table. They thought they had buried me. They didn't know I had a shovel. 2 days later, at 11:45 p.m., the silence in my apartment was deafening. Outside my window, the city lights blurred through a steady, depressing drizzle. Inside, the only illumination came from the harsh, blue glow of my 3 computer monitors. I sat at my desk, a mug of black coffee growing cold beside my keyboard. On the wall-mounted television muted, the late-night news was playing a continuous loop. There was Captain Cameron, standing on a podium in front of City Hall, receiving a key to the city from the governor. The chyron across the bottom of the screen read, "Hero of Highway 80, Captain Cameron SAVES, Flight 412. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the bitter acidity of the coffee. The media had swallowed the airline's narrative completely. The hysterical rogue engineer had caused the crisis, and the brave, seasoned pilot had swooped in to land the plane against impossible odds. It was a perfect, neatly packaged lie. But I knew the truth, and more importantly, I had the means to prove it. As a lead systems certified flight engineer, My understanding of the Boeing 757's avionics went far beyond the standard manual. Years ago, I had helped design the patch for the encrypted telemetry systems used by the airline. I knew that the physical black box in the tail of the plane was outdated technology, vulnerable to fire, impact, and most importantly, human tampering. During our terrifying descent, while Cameron was frozen in shock and the first officer was screaming, my hands had been flying across the console. While I was cutting the fuel lines and preparing the fire suppression systems, I had simultaneously run a shadow protocol. I opened a backdoor in the aircraft's communication relay, bypassing the damaged central computer, and initiated a continuous, encrypted burst transmission of the raw flight data directly to my personal, secure cloud server. I cracked my knuckles and turned my attention to the center monitor. The file was sitting there, a massive, compressed packet of hexadecimal code. It looked like a wall of absolute gibberish to the untrained eye. But to me, it was the digital DNA of Flight 412. It was the absolute, unalterable truth. The encryption was heavy, a corporate-grade cipher designed to keep competitors from stealing flight efficiency data. But I had written the backdoor. I knew the architecture. At 01:20 a.m., my fingers began to fly across the mechanical keyboard, the rapid clacking sounding like distant gunfire in the quiet apartment. I ran a brute force decryption script, feeding it the specific algorithm keys I had memorized years ago for just such an emergency. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 1%, 10%. The heat from my computer tower warmed my legs. I watched Cameron on the muted television, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands, playing the hero. I felt a cold, sharp focus settle over me. I wasn't going to just clear my name. I was going to dismantle his entire life, piece by piece, line by line of code. At 03:15 a.m., the decryption script finished with a soft, triumphant chime. The wall of hexadecimal code vanished, replaced by an expansive, beautifully structured spreadsheet. It contained thousands of rows of data, time-stamped to the millisecond. Engine temperatures, hydraulic pressures, pilot inputs, warning triggers, and communication logs. It was the ghost of Flight 412, resurrected in my living room. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the data, ready to find the smoking gun. The digital numbers painted a picture clearer than any high-definition photograph. It was 07:30 a.m., and the gray morning light was just beginning to filter through my blinds, but I hadn't slept a wink. I was completely wired, running on pure adrenaline and the thrill of the hunt. The spreadsheet on my monitor was a roadmap of negligence and criminal greed, and I was following it straight to Captain Cameron's front door. I started by tracing the timeline backward, starting from the exact moment the engine exploded. At 07:15 a.m., the data showed a massive, catastrophic spike in the exhaust gas temperature, followed immediately by a total loss of oil pressure. But that was the symptom, not the disease. I needed the cause. I scrolled back to 07:10 a.m., the moment we were holding on the taxiway. There it was. My console input, a logged warning of a thermal variance in Engine 2. And right beside it, the timestamp of Captain Cameron's override command, dismissing the warning from the master computer. But even that wasn't the killing blow. That just proved he was careless. I needed to prove he was corrupt. I kept scrolling back, past pushback, past boarding, all the way to 05:45 a.m., when the aircraft was still sitting dark and quiet at the gate. My eyes locked onto a string of data that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a maintenance log entry. 3 days prior, a routine ultrasonic inspection of the titanium compressor blades in Engine 2 had flagged a microscopic stress fracture. It was a code red maintenance hold. The plane legally could not be flown until the entire engine core was dismantled and the blade replaced. It was a repair that would take 48 hours and cost the airline a fortune in delays and grounded equipment. But at 05:50 a.m. on the morning of our flight, someone had logged into the central maintenance computer using Captain Cameron's unique, highly restricted pilot identification credential. The data showed that Cameron had manually cleared the code red hold. He had authorized a temporary operational variance, a loophole usually reserved for minor, non-critical issues like a broken reading light, to bypass the engine repair. Why? I pulled up the airline's internal financial metrics, a database I still had read-only access to. There it was. Captain Cameron was at the end of his fiscal quarter. If he maintained a 98% on-time departure rate, he was guaranteed a massive, six-figure performance bonus. Grounding Flight 412 would have dropped him to 96%. He had risked 200 lives and my entire career for a paycheck. But the web of corruption went deeper. A pilot cannot clear a code red maintenance hold alone. The system requires a secondary authorization from the Federal Aviation Administration. I looked back at the flight data. At 06:05 a.m., a secondary digital signature had approved Cameron's override. The signature belonged to Julian Bates, the very same FAA inspector who had sat in the boardroom and blamed me for the crash. Bates had signed off on a plane he knew was a flying death trap. The two of them were in it together, trading safety for bonuses and corporate kickbacks. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. The truth was heavier than I had anticipated. This wasn't just a cover-up of a pilot's mistake. It was a systemic, criminal conspiracy. If I simply handed this data over to the press, Aris's high-priced lawyers would bury it in injunctions, claim the data was fabricated, and drag it out in court for years. I needed a strategy. I needed to strike where they couldn't hide behind their money. I needed to expose them perfectly. It was 10:00 a.m. on Tuesday when I finally stepped away from my glowing monitors. The rain had stopped, leaving the city streets slick and gray, mirroring the cold reality I had just uncovered. I had the digital ghost of Flight 412, proving Captain Cameron bypassed the engine maintenance, but proving the corrupt intent required more than just lines of hexadecimal code. I needed to establish the financial bridge between Cameron and Julian Bates, the FAA inspector who had illegally authorized the override. Without outside assistance to rely on, I had to find a different way inside their operation. I needed someone who saw the things executives thought were invisible. I needed Gabriella Flores. Gabriella was the lead flight attendant on Flight 412. While the pilots locked themselves behind reinforced cockpit doors, Gabriella managed the entire social ecosystem of the aircraft and the crew layovers. She possessed a quiet intelligence, observing everything while serving coffee and distributing warm towels. I pulled out an encrypted burner phone and sent her a simple, prearranged text message. "The coffee at the terminal is cold." It was a phrase we had established years ago for union emergencies. Less than an hour later, I was sitting on a damp wooden bench in a secluded corner of Liberty State Park, watching the Manhattan skyline across the water. At 11:30 a.m., Gabriella approached. She wore a dark trench coat, a stark contrast to her crisp airline uniform, and her eyes darted nervously around the empty park. She sat down next to me, keeping a full foot of space between us. "Allison," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "the company is watching everyone." Aris sent out a memo threatening immediate termination for anyone who speaks to you. "They are saying you had a mental breakdown." "I'm perfectly sane, Gabby," I replied, keeping my voice steady and reassuring. "But I need your help. I have the actual black box data. Cameron caused the fire. He bypassed a code red maintenance hold for a bonus, and Julian Bates from the FAA signed off on it. I need to prove they are coordinating off the books." Gabriella stared at me, the fear in her eyes slowly hardening into a sharp, focused anger. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, silver USB drive, pressing it into my palm. "I don't know about the FAA, Allison, but I know Captain Cameron. I keep my own logs of crew layovers and hotel assignments to protect the junior flight attendants from his inappropriate behavior. Over the past year, every time we had a layover in Miami, Cameron would disappear to a private VIP lounge at the marina." "Did he meet anyone there?" I asked, my fingers closing tightly around the small metal drive. "I followed him once, 3 months ago," Gabriella confessed, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He met with a man matching Bates's description. They boarded a private yacht registered to a shell company. I took photos of the tail numbers on the private helicopter that brought Bates in. By 2:00 p.m., I was back at my desk, plugging Gabriella's drive into my secure server. The photographs were perfectly clear. I ran the helicopter's tail number through an open-source aviation registry. It belonged to a corporate holding group in the Cayman Islands. Utilizing my systems engineering background, I initiated a deep dive packet trace, bouncing my IP address through a dozen proxy servers until I breached the holding group's unsecured public server directory. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. The shell company was a front for Julian Bates. And sitting right there in the ledger was a recurring quarterly deposit of $50,000, transferred directly from a dummy account controlled by Captain Cameron. It was a perfectly orchestrated bribe. Cameron paid Bates to look the other way, ensuring his aircraft never faced costly maintenance delays, and in return, Cameron secured his massive quarterly performance bonuses. They had traded 200 lives for a yacht and a payout. I had them. The investigation was complete. Now it was time to build the weapon. At 8:00 a.m. on Wednesday, my apartment felt like a war room. I had the encrypted flight data, the photographs from Gabriella, and the offshore banking ledgers securely isolated on an encrypted external drive. But raw data, no matter how damning, is easily suppressed by corporate lawyers if handed directly to a newsroom. Thomas Harris and his legal team would simply bury the files under injunctions and claim the documents were fabricated by a disgruntled former employee. If I was going to strike, I had to bypass the media entirely. I had to deliver the truth directly to the people who held the purse strings of the airline, the major shareholders. Every quarter, the airline held a massive, highly publicized shareholder broadcast. It was a carefully choreographed digital event where CEO Thomas Harris presented the company's financial triumphs and safety records to institutional investors worldwide. The next broadcast was scheduled for Friday at 10:00 a.m. They were planning to parade Captain Cameron on the live feed as the hero of Highway 80, using his fabricated bravery to boost the stock price. It was the perfect stage for a public execution. For the next 48 hours, I barely moved from my chair. I survived on stale crackers and lukewarm water, my eyes burning from the harsh glare of the monitors. I was writing a highly aggressive, self-executing digital payload. Using the very same backdoor architecture I had designed for the airline's internal communication systems, I coded a parasitic script that would latch onto the company's primary broadcasting server. It wasn't a hack in the traditional sense. It was a master override, utilizing my still-active senior engineering credentials that they had arrogantly forgotten to purge from the deepest legacy systems. At 11:45 p.m. on Thursday, the code was finally finished. I tested the deployment sequence in a closed sandbox environment on my server. The script operated flawlessly. It was designed to lay dormant inside the airline's network until the exact moment Harris activated the live shareholder feed. Once the broadcast hit peak viewership, my program would lock out all external controls, hijacking the video and audio streams simultaneously. There would be no way for their IT department to cut the feed without physically destroying the servers in their basement. I leaned back, my muscles screaming in protest from the days of tension. The digital weapon was primed, a ticking time bomb composed of pure, unadulterated truth. It contained the cockpit voice recordings I had extracted from the telemetry data, the visual proof of Cameron's maintenance override, and the glaring financial records of his bribes to Julian Bates. It was a complete narrative of their corruption, packaged and ready to detonate in front of 10,000 furious investors. I took a deep breath, staring at the flashing cursor on the terminal window. All that was left was to plant the seed. At exactly 2:00 a.m., when the airline's network traffic was at its lowest, I initiated the upload. I watched the progress bar inch across the screen, a silent, invisible missile hurtling toward corporate headquarters. The green text flashed, payload delivered and dormant. The trap was set, but a digital strike wasn't enough. I needed to ensure that when the bomb went off, the rats couldn't flee the sinking ship. I needed to corner the weakest link in their conspiracy and force a total collapse of their defensive line. Julian Bates was a government employee playing a dangerous game. He was motivated by greed, but he was ultimately a coward who relied on the shadows to protect his illicit wealth. I knew that if pushed into a corner, Bates would instantly turn on Captain Cameron to save his own skin. Before the broadcast on Friday, I needed to look him in the eye and watch his entire world crumble. I wanted him to feel the exact same paralyzing terror I felt at 35,000 feet. I printed hard copies of the bank transfers, shut down my monitors, and stepped out into the dark city. It was 7:15 a.m. on Friday morning. The air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to cast long, golden shadows across the pavement outside the regional FAA headquarters. I sat in a booth at the upscale coffee shop across the street, a place where bureaucrats paid $7 for espresso. I knew Julian Bates's routine perfectly. Every morning at precisely 7:30 a.m., he ordered a skim latte and a blueberry muffin before walking into his office to stamp approvals on falsified safety documents. I sipped my black tea, watching the glass doors. My manila folder rested heavy on the table. At 7:28 a.m., Bates walked in. He was wearing a sharply tailored gray suit, holding a leather briefcase, projecting the image of a respectable government official. He placed his order and turned around, scanning the room for an empty table. His eyes landed on me. For a split second, a flash of genuine panic crossed his face, quickly masked by a forced, condescending smile. He walked over, his posture stiff and defensive. "Ms. Scott," he said, his voice carrying a nervous tremor. "I really don't think it's appropriate for us to be speaking. The investigation into your actions on Flight 412 is ongoing, and my legal department." "Sit down, Julian," I commanded, my voice flat, leaving absolutely no room for debate. I didn't raise my voice, but the absolute authority in my tone made him freeze. Reluctantly, he slid into the booth opposite me, clutching his briefcase against his chest like a physical shield against the truth. "I have a meeting in 10 minutes, he muttered, glancing nervously at the door. "If you are here to plead for your job, you are wasting your time. The data is clear." "You're right, the data is incredibly clear," I replied smoothly. I slid the manila folder across the table, exactly as Thomas Harris had done to me days earlier. "Open it." Bates hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened the flap. He pulled out the first sheet of paper. It was a high-resolution photograph of him boarding the Cayman Islands yacht with Captain Cameron. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a wax figure. He quickly flipped to the next page, revealing the detailed offshore bank ledgers, highlighting the $50,000 transfers perfectly synced with Cameron's performance bonuses. This is fabricated," Bates stammered, a bead of sweat forming on his temple. "This is an outrageous forgery. You hacked this together because you are desperate." "I am a lead systems certified flight engineer, Julian," I said, leaning over the table, my eyes locked onto his panicked gaze. "I pulled the ghost data from the black box during the descent. I have the digital timestamp of your secure login authorizing Cameron's code red maintenance override at 06:05 a.m. on the morning of the flight. You took a bribe, and you let a compromised aircraft take to the sky. That is federal corruption, criminal negligence, and attempted manslaughter." Bates couldn't speak. His mouth opened and closed silently, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The arrogant inspector was gone, replaced by a terrified criminal, realizing the walls had completely closed in. In exactly 2 hours at 10:00 a.m., CEO Thomas Harris is hosting the quarterly shareholder broadcast, I continued, my voice sharp and relentless. "I have set a digital payload to hijack that live feed. Every major investor, every news outlet, and the Department of Justice will receive this entire folder simultaneously. Your life, as you know it, ends at 10 o'clock. "Please," Bates whispered, his voice cracking. "Allison, please, I have a family. Cameron pressured me. He said it was just a sensor glitch. He swore the engine was perfectly fine. "You are a coward, Julian," I sneered, standing up from the booth. "I don't care about your excuses. When the feed goes live, I suggest you take that briefcase and walk straight to the FBI field office down the street. If you confess before the broadcast, you might avoid a maximum sentence. If you run, I will make sure they hunt you down." I left him sitting there, trembling over his cold coffee, ready for the final boardroom trap. At 09:45 a.m., the glass and steel lobby of the airline's corporate headquarters was bustling with executives and sharply dressed public relations teams. My employee access badge, which Human Resources had arrogantly neglected to deactivate in their haste to legally bury me, granted me quiet entry through the side security turnstiles. The security guard didn't even look up from his phone. I slipped into the shadows of the main auditorium's upper balcony, an invisible observer to their grand, deceitful theater. Below me, the massive digital screens displayed the holding card for the quarterly shareholder broadcast. The massive room smelled of polished leather, expensive floor wax, and the heavily catered pastries sitting untouched on the side tables. At 09:55 a.m., CEO Thomas Aris stepped up to the sleek acrylic podium, his tailored Italian suit catching the bright, artificial studio lights. To his right sat Captain Cameron, adorned in his crisp, impeccably pressed uniform, looking every bit the fabricated hero they needed him to be. The live viewer count in the corner of the primary screen rapidly ticked upwards. 50,000, 70,000, 100,000 concurrent institutional and private investors logging in from around the globe. The financial weight in the room was palpable, a heavy blanket of expectation and greed. "Good morning, valued shareholders," Aris began at exactly 10:00 a.m., his voice radiating false confidence and practiced, focus group-tested warmth. "This quarter has been a testament to our airline's resilience and unwavering commitment to safety. We faced an unprecedented mechanical anomaly on Flight 412, but thanks to the extraordinary skill and decisive action of Captain Cameron, tragedy was averted. He represents the absolute best of our corporate family." The audience in the room offered a polite, sycophantic applause. Cameron smiled modestly, adjusting his silk tie. It was a perfectly rehearsed performance, a beautiful lie designed to inflate the stock price. At 10:02 a.m., I pulled out my encrypted burner phone and typed a single line of code into the terminal application, transmitting the final activation sequence to my dormant digital payload. The execution was instantaneous and violently disruptive. Aris was mid-sentence when the podium microphone squealed with a sudden, ear-piercing feedback loop. He flinched, tapping the metal mesh of the mic, but the audio was completely dead. The massive, 30-foot digital screens behind him violently flickered from the soothing corporate blue logo to a stark, blinding black. A collective gasp rippled through the darkened auditorium. Then, the screens illuminated again, projecting a high-definition, unignorable image of the offshore bank transfer ledger. The numbers were enormous, $50,000 highlighted in glowing neon red, tracing directly from Cameron's dummy account to Julian Bates's Cayman Islands shell company. "What is this? Cut the feed. Cut it now." Aris barked, his practiced demeanor completely shattering into raw panic. He waved frantically at the control booth behind the glass, but the technicians were already throwing their hands up in pure defeat. My system override had locked them out entirely. The visual vanished, replaced by the pristine audio recording I had ripped from the cockpit voice recorder, amplified through the auditorium's massive surround sound speakers. "I told you to leave it alone. It's a faulty sensor. We have an on-time departure bonus on the line." Cameron's arrogant voice echoed off the walls, raw, cruel, and undeniable. "You women think you can come in here and make executive decisions. You're fired, Allison." The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Every executive, every board member, and hundreds of thousands of investors online were listening to the unvarnished truth. The screen shifted one final time, displaying the digital timestamp of Cameron's maintenance override, co-signed by Julian Bates, exactly 1 hour before takeoff. The evidence of their corruption was now an indelible public record, burning brightly for the entire world to witness. Aris stood frozen at the podium, his face ghostly pale, while Cameron stared at the screen, the smugness completely erased, replaced by the horrified realization that his legacy was instantly and permanently destroyed. At 10:05 a.m., the auditorium erupted into absolute chaos. The broadcast feed, carrying the undeniable proof of Captain Cameron's corruption, continued to stream seamlessly to the hundreds of thousands of investors online. In the front row, the major institutional shareholders were already aggressively typing on their phones, undoubtedly issuing frantic sell orders. The airline's stock price, which had been artificially propped up by Aris's lies, was about to enter a catastrophic, unrecoverable freefall. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, choked with the collective panic of wealthy men losing their fortunes in real time. Captain Cameron stumbled backward from his pristine leather chair, his face a mask of sheer terror. The commanding aura he had worn like a shield for decades had completely evaporated. He looked exactly like the terrified, incompetent man who had frozen at the yoke of a burning airplane. "This is a setup." Cameron screamed, his voice cracking loudly over the murmur of the panicked crowd. He pointed a trembling finger at the blackened screens. "That audio is doctored. She hacked the system. Tom, you have to tell them this is a lie." But Thomas Aris wasn't looking at Cameron. The CEO was staring down at his tablet, his face drained of all color, watching the company's valuation plummet by the second. Aris was a survivor of corporate warfare, and he knew instantly that the only way to salvage the wreckage was to amputate the infected limb. He slowly raised his head, his eyes cold and entirely devoid of the warmth he had projected just 5 minutes earlier. "Security," Aris commanded, his voice trembling but loud enough to cut through the noise. "Restrain the captain. Do not let him leave this room." Cameron's eyes widened in profound betrayal. "Tom, you can't do this. I saved this airline millions over the years. You knew about the maintenance waivers, you all knew." His desperate confession echoed through the room, sealing his own fate. 2 large corporate security guards advanced down the center aisle, their faces grim and unyielding. Cameron tried to bolt toward the side exit, his polished shoes slipping clumsily on the expensive hardwood floor, but they caught him easily, grabbing him by the shoulders of his decorated uniform. He struggled weakly, looking pathetic and small as they forced him back into a chair. From my vantage point in the darkened balcony, I watched the scene unfold with a deep, chilling satisfaction. I didn't smile, and I didn't cheer. I just watched the precise mechanical failure of a corrupt system I had meticulously engineered. At 10:15 a.m., the heavy oak doors at the back of the auditorium swung open. 4 federal agents, clad in dark suits and windbreakers bearing the FBI insignia, marched swiftly down the aisle. True to my prediction, Julian Bates had broken. Facing a lifetime in federal prison, the cowardly FAA inspector had walked straight into the field office down the street, handed over his own laptop, and confessed to everything in a desperate bid for a plea deal. The federal agents didn't even pause to speak to Aris. They walked directly to Captain Cameron. "Richard Cameron," the lead agent announced, his voice booming with unquestionable authority. "You are under arrest for federal corruption, wire fraud, and the reckless endangerment of a commercial aircraft. Stand up and place your hands behind your back." The metallic click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the room. As they marched Cameron up the center aisle, his head bowed in absolute disgrace, he briefly looked up toward the balcony. I don't know if he could see me standing there in the shadows, but I stepped slightly into the ambient light of the exit sign, making sure my silhouette was visible. I wanted him to know exactly who had pulled the lever on his trapdoor. He broke eye contact immediately, his spirit utterly broken. The hero of Highway 80 was gone, replaced by a common criminal walking toward a concrete cell. 6 months later, at precisely 4:00 p.m. on a brisk, golden autumn afternoon, the air smelled wonderfully of dried leaves, pine needles, and freshly brewed dark roast coffee. I sat comfortably in a rocking chair on the sweeping wooden porch of a small, highly successful independent aviation consulting firm I had founded in upstate New York. The sprawling, frantic energy of the corporate terminal and the toxic egos of the boardroom were a distant, fading memory. Here, I watched small, single-engine Cessnas take off and land against a stunning canvas of brilliant orange and purple clouds. The profound peace I felt in my chest was absolute, earned through the hardest, most terrifying battle of my entire life. The public fallout from the digital strike had been monumental and relentless. The Department of Justice had immediately launched a massive, sweeping investigation into the airline's entire operational history. CEO Thomas Aris was aggressively ousted by the furious board of directors and was currently facing his own severe federal indictments for gross negligence and corporate conspiracy. Julian Bates took a desperate plea deal and was serving a 5-year sentence in a minimum security facility. And Captain Cameron, the man who had arrogantly fired me at 35,000 feet and tried to bury my 20-year career to protect his inflated ego and his bank account, was found guilty on all counts by a federal jury. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, permanently stripped of his pilot's license, his wealth, and his fabricated legacy. The life twist he never saw coming was born from his own technological ignorance and crippling arrogance. He genuinely believed that smashing a physical black box on a concrete highway could permanently erase the truth. He never understood that as a lead systems certified flight engineer, the aircraft and I spoke a complex language he couldn't even begin to comprehend. That encrypted, real-time telemetry backup I secretly initiated during our terrifying descent wasn't just raw data. It was my voice, immortalized securely in the cloud, proving my absolute competence and his fatal negligence. The machine had told the unvarnished truth, even when the powerful men in the boardroom lied. Now, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you, the person watching this, because the battles we fight in the workplace often share the exact same anatomy, regardless of your specific industry. I made a critical mistake in the beginning. I blindly trusted the established chain of command. I falsely believed that because a man wore 4 gold stripes on his shoulder, the corporate system would inherently check his dangerous hubris. I was wrong. My lesson learned was agonizing but incredibly invaluable. Your personal integrity is always, undoubtedly more important than your blind compliance. When you know deep down that something is fundamentally wrong, you cannot allow the sheer intimidation of authority to silence your hard-earned expertise. Here is my actionable advice if you ever find yourself facing a corrupt manager, a toxic workplace, or an unfair accusation. First, document absolutely everything. Do not rely solely on your memory or verbal promises. Rely on hard timestamps, forwarded emails, and verifiable data. The truth always needs an undeniable paper trail. Second, strive to understand the systems and rules you work within far better than the people trying to actively exploit them. True knowledge is the ultimate leverage against corruption. And finally, never, ever let an arrogant boss define your worth or force you into a state of emotional panic. Trust your training, securely gather your evidence in silence, and when the exact right time comes to stand up for yourself, make sure your strike is precise, overwhelming, and undeniable. I lost my position at that major airline, but I gained something infinitely more valuable: total ownership of my own life and my uncompromised dignity. The skies are finally clear, and for the first time in my professional life, I am the sole person charting the flight path.